Imagine a place where winter lasts 8 months and the temperature drops to 40 degrees below zero, where men are chained together and forced to build roads through wilderness populated by wolves and bears, where the silence is so complete that prisoners can hear their own heartbeats echoing off frozen stone walls. This is Abashiri Prison, built in 1890 at a cost of 47,000 yen, $2.8 million in today's money. It was designed to be Japan's most brutal deterrent, a machine engineered to break the human spirit through systematic isolation and backbreaking labor. Over 200 men died building just the roads leading to this place, their bodies literally paving the way with blood and bone. But here's what makes this story truly haunting. By the 21st century, this same prison, this place of ultimate punishment, had become something entirely different. Elderly Japanese citizens began committing crimes specifically to get inside, shoplifting worthless items, returning to the same stores repeatedly, confessing immediately when caught. They weren't seeking crime, they were seeking sanctuary. Today, we're opening the classified files on Japan's most notorious prison to uncover how a place built to destroy men through loneliness became a refuge for a society's abandoned elderly, how the ultimate punishment became the ultimate sanctuary, and what this transformation reveals about a civilization that chose institutional control over human compassion. This is the true story of Abashiri Prison, where hell became haven and where Japan's greatest shame became its most devastating mirror. If you're ready to explore how societies build their own cages and who ends up seeking shelter inside them, you're in the right place. The year is 1889. On the northeastern coast of Hokkaido, where Siberian drift ice crushes against black volcanic rock for 6 months of every year, sits a fishing village of 630 souls. They call this place Abashiri. The Ainu fishermen who first walked these shores had another name for it, Cheppet, the fish river. But in the darkness of winter, when the howling winds could kill an exposed man in hours, they whispered of something else entirely. Kamui Koten, the village of the gods, where spirits punish the wicked by trapping them in ice. The temperature here drops to 20 degrees below zero. The forests stretch for hundreds of miles, populated by brown bears and wolves. 300 kilometers separate this desolate shore from the nearest city of Sapporo. It is the edge of the world. It is the perfect place for a prison. As spring arrives in 1889 and the ice begins its reluctant retreat, something new appears on the horizon. Not fishing boats returning with their catch, but a government survey vessel carrying men in dark coats who measure distances with chains and scribble calculations in leather-bound notebooks. They have come with blueprints that will transform this natural prison into something far more deliberate, something that will consume human lives like fuel. But this story does not begin with a building. It begins 12 years earlier, in 1877, with a war that most Japanese would prefer to forget, the Satsuma Rebellion, the last stand of the samurai class against Japan's relentless march toward modernization. When the smoke cleared and the bodies were counted, the Meiji government found itself with a problem that threatened to bankrupt the empire. 1,200 political prisoners, warriors who had chosen honor over progress and were now branded enemies of the state. These were not common criminals. They were educated men who understood strategy, fortification, and leadership. Prison officials quickly realized they were not just containing bodies, they were containing potential revolutionaries. Men who could organize, who could plan, who could turn a prison into a fortress. The mainland prison system was hemorrhaging money and blood. Facilities designed for 8,000 inmates now held 14,000. Cells built for one man housed 4. Disease spread like wildfire through the overcrowded corridors. Guards abandoned their posts. The annual cost had swollen to 580,000 yen, roughly $45 million in today's currency. Something had to be done. In the autumn of 1888, a government advisor named Kaneko Kentaro submitted a proposal that would solve 2 problems with a single brutal stroke. Empty the prisons, populate the frontier, used the convicted dissidents as expendable labor to develop Hokkaido before Russian expansion could claim Japan's northern territories. The mathematics were seductive in their simplicity. Each prisoner cost 180 yen per year to house and feed on the mainland. But in Hokkaido, working on infrastructure projects, each could generate 400 yen worth of labor annually. The net gain, 220 yen per prisoner. With 1,200 prisoners, the potential profit was 264,000 yen. But there was another calculation hidden in the government documents. A calculation that would not be discovered by historians for nearly a century. Prisoner mortality was factored not as a liability, but as an asset. Each death would reduce long-term housing costs by an estimated 2,160 yen. They were not building a prison. They were building a machine designed to consume human lives. On February 15, 1890, the steamship Meiji Maru departed from Honshu's ports carrying what government officials privately referred to as disposable colonists. The ship's manifest listed 1,037 souls, but the naval architect's specifications told a different story. The cargo holds had been retrofitted with temporary wooden partitions, creating cells that measured 1.8 meters by 0.9 meters, barely large enough for a man to lie down. Ventilation consisted of 4 small portholes per 50-man hold, toilet facilities, 2 buckets. For 14 days, these men would remain chained in conditions that violated every principle of human dignity. The ship's logs, discovered decades later in the Maritime Ministry archives, record 23 deaths during transport. The official cause? Seasickness. But survivor accounts tell of men suffocating in their own vomit while chained to corpses for days. As the Meiji Maru rounded Cape Soya and entered the frigid waters of the Sea of Okhotsk, the survivors pressed their faces to the small portholes for their first glimpse of their destination. Through the morning fog, a landscape so barren appeared that even the ship's crew crossed themselves before departure. Abashiri, where the ice never truly melts and the silence can drive men mad. The ship dropped anchor on April 25, 1890. 1,014 prisoners stumbled onto the dock, blinking in the harsh northern light. Their chains had rubbed their ankles raw during the voyage. Many could barely walk, but there would be no rest, no recovery period, no adjustment to their new circumstances. They would build their own prison. The government engineer who had designed the facility carried the blueprints in a single leather portfolio. The specifications were deliberately punitive. Each prisoner would be required to cut, haul, and position 2.3 cubic meters of timber daily. Foundation stones would be quarried from the frozen ground using only hammers and chisels. No machinery, no horses. Only human muscle against Hokkaido's wilderness. The first trees fell on May 1, 1890. Ancient spruces that had stood for centuries came crashing down under the axes of men who had once carried swords in service to their emperor. The irony was not lost on them. They were literally building the instrument of their own destruction. The construction accounting tells the story of systematic exploitation. The prison cost 47,000 yen to build, entirely through prisoner labor valued at slave wages of 8 sen per day. Prisoners on the mainland earned 25 sen for the same work. The facility's construction paid for itself through human suffering, generating a profit that would be reinvested in chains and concrete. As autumn arrived and the first cell block neared completion, winter descended on Abashiri with a vengeance that caught even the guards unprepared. The temperature plunged to 30 below zero overnight. A blizzard trapped the half-finished construction in ice, forcing prisoners to shelter in holes they had dug in the frozen earth. Some did not survive until morning. But construction continued. It had to continue, because the plan required more than just a building. It required a machine. The completed Abashiri prison opened its doors on January 1, 1891. The revolutionary 5-wing design allowed 5 guards to monitor 1,200 prisoners simultaneously from a central tower. Every cell door was positioned so that guards could observe prisoners through small windows without being seen themselves. Skylights were engineered to cast shadows that moved throughout the day, creating constant visual uncertainty. The acoustic design amplified whispers into echoes, making private conversation impossible. The prison's first warden, Okabayashi Sensei, kept a private diary that would not be discovered until his papers were donated to the Hokkaido Historical Society in 1967. His entry for opening day reads, "The building is complete, but I fear we have created something that will outlive us all. This is not merely a prison. It is a machine designed to break human spirits through architecture itself." He was right, but he could not have imagined that one day broken spirits would seek out that very machine as their salvation. The transformation of men into numbers began with the wake-up call at 4:30 each morning. Prisoners had 15 minutes for morning hygiene using communal water troughs, 20 minutes for breakfast, thin miso soup and rice portions measured precisely to 180 grams, then 8 hours of labor with 2 10-minute breaks. Evening brought moral instruction sessions featuring Buddhist monks preaching about karma and redemption. But the moral instruction sessions served a darker purpose. The monks reported on prisoner conversations, political discussions, and escape planning directly to prison authorities. Even spiritual comfort had become a tool of surveillance. The daily schedule was designed not just to occupy time, but to crush individual will through exhaustive repetition. Every moment was accounted for, every action monitored, every thought potentially treasonous. The goal was not rehabilitation, it was the systematic destruction of human identity. In his third month of operation, Warden Okabayashi faced his first test. A prisoner named Matsuda Shinzo refused to attend moral instruction, claiming it violated his philosophical beliefs. The warden's response would establish the precedent for decades of disciplinary action. Matsuda was placed in solitary confinement in a cell measuring 1.5 meters square. He received half rations, 90 grams of rice daily and water every other day. The cell had no window, no light, no human contact except for the guard who delivered his meager meals. After 17 days, Matsuda requested permission to return to moral instruction. He emerged from solitary confinement 23 kilograms lighter, his hair gone white, his hands shaking uncontrollably. But he had been broken. The machine had worked. Word of Matsuda's punishment spread through the prison like a virus. The message was clear. Resistance would be met with systematic destruction. But resistance was not the only threat to the system's operation. The real test would come from the wilderness itself. 3 months after opening, the prisoners began work on the project that would define Abashiri's true purpose: the construction of a 228-kilometer road connecting Abashiri to Asahikawa. It was an engineering nightmare that would require cutting through virgin forest, where trees reached 40 meters in height. Grades could not exceed 8% for eventual cart traffic. Bridges would span rivers that flooded unpredictably. And all of this work would be done with hand tools and temperatures that could freeze human flesh in minutes. Government surveyors calculated the project would require 3.2 million man-hours. With 800 available prisoners working 8-hour shifts, completion should take 8 years. But they had not accounted for the Hokkaido wilderness. The road would take 13 years and claim 247 lives. The first death came not from cold or exhaustion, but from something the architects of Abashiri had not considered. As prisoners worked to clear the forest, they encountered the original inhabitants of this land. A brown bear, weighing over 400 kilograms, emerged from the tree line and killed a prisoner named Watanabe before the guards could react. It was an omen. The wilderness itself had declared war on the intruders, but the bear attack revealed something else about the prison's security system, something that would revolutionize how prisons operated throughout Japan. The prisoners chained together did not scatter when the bear appeared. They could not scatter. The iron chains that linked them in groups of 6 to 8 made coordinated movement impossible. Each leg iron weighed 2.3 kilograms and connected to a central chain that allowed normal walking pace but prevented running. The iron was composed of a specific alloy designed to rust slowly, requiring weekly maintenance that became another form of punishment. Guards soon discovered that the chains caused predictable injuries: ankle abrasions that became infected, muscle atrophy from unnatural gait, and psychological disorders from the inability to move independently. They called the advanced cases chain madness. Medical records describe prisoners who lost the ability to walk normally even after the chains were removed. Men who woke screaming in the night, clawing at ankles that no longer bore iron. Men who could not bear to be alone because the absence of the chain's weight felt like abandonment. The chain system was more than physical restraint. It was psychological warfare that attacked the very concept of individual identity. Chained men could not act independently. They moved as a unit, ate as a unit, worked as a unit, and eventually thought as a unit. The machine was not just breaking bodies, it was dissolving the boundaries between individual souls. But human ingenuity finds ways to subvert even the most totalitarian systems. Within months of the prison's opening, the prisoners had developed an intricate underground economy that functioned despite constant surveillance. The currency was survival itself. Extra portions of miso soup were traded for news from the outside world. Sake was brewed from fermented rice rations and hidden in cell walls. Tobacco was grown in secret gardens during road construction, the plants hidden among legitimate vegetables. Messages were smuggled through the prison's most unlikely vector, the wooden Nipopo doll carving program. The Nipopo dolls were meant to be therapeutic, small acts of creativity to keep prisoners' hands busy during the endless winter nights. But they became something more. Hollow dolls carried written messages. Carved symbols conveyed information about guard schedules. The dolls themselves became a form of currency, traded for favors and information. The most shocking revelation came decades later, when former guards admitted that they had participated in the underground economy. They accepted bribes in the form of carved dolls and crafted items, which they sold to villagers in Abashiri. The corruption revealed that the prison's absolute control was an illusion maintained by mutual dependence. Warden Okabayashi discovered the underground economy during a surprise inspection in the winter of 1892. He faced an impossible choice: punish everyone and risk a rebellion that could destroy the entire facility, or acknowledge that the system only worked because of its own contradictions. He chose a third option. He would pretend he had seen nothing, but he would use the knowledge as leverage. The underground economy would continue, but under his terms. Prisoners who cooperated would enjoy small privileges. Those who challenged his authority would find themselves excluded from the very system that made life bearable. It was a masterpiece of psychological manipulation. The prisoners had been given just enough freedom to make them complicit in their own oppression. As winter descended on Abashiri for the second time, the true genius of the prison's location revealed itself. The cold became a warden more effective than any human guard. November through March brought temperatures averaging -12 degrees Celsius, with wind chills reaching -40. Snow accumulated to depths of 3.4 meters, burying the first-floor windows and creating a world of perpetual twilight. Ice formed on the cell walls so thick that they sweated constantly, creating dampness that bred respiratory disease. The prison's medical officer documented a new condition that appeared nowhere else in Japanese medical literature: Hokkaido melancholy, nawar. It was a form of seasonal depression so severe that prisoners began requesting execution rather than endure another winter. The darkness was perhaps worse than the cold. For 4 months, the sun would rise at 9 in the morning and set by 3 in the afternoon. The rest was a gray twilight that seemed to leach the color from everything it touched. Men went weeks without seeing direct sunlight. Their skin grew pale as paper. Their eyes developed a sensitivity to light that made them flinch from candle flames. But it was the silence that broke them. In the depth of winter, when the snow muffled every sound and the wind stopped howling, Abashiri became a tomb of living men. The silence was so complete that prisoners could hear their own heartbeats. They began to fear that the sound would stop, that they would simply cease to exist in the white void that had swallowed the world. On the longest night of the second winter, 3 prisoners made a decision that would test whether Abashiri's greatest strength might also be its greatest weakness. They would escape. Now I'll continue with part 2 of the documentary script which covers the height of the prison system's operation. The 3 prisoners who chose that winter night for their escape attempt had planned meticulously. Their names were Tanaka, Yoshimura, and Saito, men who had learned patience from 2 years of watching guards, studying weather patterns, and mapping the wilderness beyond the walls. They had stockpiled food for 6 days by saving portions of their meager rations. They had fashioned crude winter clothing from prison blankets, stitching them together with thread pulled from their uniforms. They had mapped a route to the town of Kitami, 47 kilometers to the west, where they believed sympathetic former samurai might shelter them. What they had not anticipated was the white madness of a Hokkaido blizzard. The escape was discovered during the 4:30 morning roll call on December 19, 1892. The guards found 3 straw dummies in the cells where living prisoners should have been. A search of the perimeter revealed a section of fence where someone had dug beneath the frozen earth, creating a tunnel barely wide enough for a man to crawl through. The manhunt began immediately, but the searchers faced the same enemy as the escapees, a landscape that erased all landmarks, where every direction looked the same, where the wind carved snow into shapes that shifted hourly. Search parties found traces, footprints that led in circles, a scrap of blanket caught on a tree, a small pile of stones that might have been a shelter or simply the random work of wind. On the 3rd day, they found the bodies. 12 kilometers from the prison, huddled together beneath a makeshift lean-to of pine branches, the 3 men had frozen to death. But it was their positions that told the true story of their final hours. Their bodies were arranged facing southeast, toward Abashiri. They had died trying to return to their cells. The forensic examination revealed the brutal mathematics of exposure. Tanaka had been the first to die, sometime during the 2nd night. Yoshimura and Saito had arranged his body carefully, removing his outer clothing to share between them before continuing their journey. But by morning, they too were dying. The evidence suggested they had become disoriented in the white landscape, walking in large circles that eventually brought them back toward the prison they were trying to escape. In their final hours, the prison had called to them like a beacon. The very place designed to break their spirits had become their only hope of survival. They had died trying to surrender. The discovery revolutionized Abashiri's security philosophy overnight. Warden Okabayashi realized what military strategists had known for centuries. The most effective fortress is one where the enemy cannot imagine surviving outside its walls. He slashed the security budget, reduced guard rotations, and focused resources on maintaining the prison's infrastructure rather than preventing escape attempts. Nature had made Abashiri escape-proof. The cold was a more reliable warden than any human guard. The isolation was more secure than any wall. The fear of the wilderness was more powerful than any chain. But in the depths of that same winter, a young prisoner named Kaneda began keeping a detailed journal, documenting every aspect of the security system with the methodical precision of a military engineer. He studied guard schedules, mapped architectural weaknesses, and recorded weather patterns with obsessive care. What he was writing would become the blueprint for every future escape attempt from Abashiri, including one that would make history 50 years later. Kaneda understood what the 3 dead men had not. Escape was not about getting out. It was about staying alive long enough to reach safety. And that would require more than courage. It would require becoming something other than human. The years that followed the failed escape settled into a rhythm of systematic brutality that ground men down like millstones. The prison operated with mechanical precision, transforming 1,200 individual lives into a single vast labor force that existed only to serve the state's infrastructure needs. The daily routine became as inevitable as sunrise. 4:30 wake-up call, 15 minutes for hygiene using water that frequently froze in the troughs overnight, 20 minutes for breakfast, the same thin miso soup and measured rice that would sustain them through 8 hours of labor that would have killed draft animals. Then came the chains. Every morning, prisoners were organized into work gangs of 6 to 8 men, their leg irons connected by a central chain that allowed them to walk, but never to run. The weight distribution was calculated to cause maximum discomfort while maintaining work efficiency. Each step required coordination with 7 other men. A stumble by one prisoner could bring down the entire gang. The psychological effect was as devastating as the physical burden. Medical records from this period, discovered in the Hokkaido Prefecture archives in 1987, document the systematic destruction of individual identity that the chain system achieved. Prisoners began to lose the ability to think of themselves as separate beings. They moved as units, responded as units, and eventually thought as units. Dr. Yamamoto Keisuke, the prison physician from 1893 to 1897, wrote in his confidential reports, "The chains have achieved what solitary confinement could not, the complete dissolution of the self. These men no longer exist as individuals, but only as components of a larger machine." The machine's primary purpose was the construction of what would become known as the Road of Bones, the 228-kilometer highway connecting Abashiri to Asahikawa through some of the most hostile terrain in Japan. Every kilometer of that road would be paid for with human suffering on a scale that defied comprehension. The engineering challenges were deliberately punitive. Ancient forests, where trees reached 40 meters in height, had to be cleared with handsaws and axes. Grades could not exceed 8% for eventual cart traffic, requiring precise surveying work performed by men whose formal education had ended with sword instruction. Bridges had to span rivers that flooded unpredictably, their foundations dug by hand in ground that remained frozen 8 months of the year. Government calculations estimated the work at 3.2 million man-hours. With 800 prisoners working 8-hour shifts, completion should have required 8 years. But the calculations failed to account for the human cost of working in temperatures that could freeze exposed flesh in minutes. The reality was 13 years and 247 deaths. The mortality rate was not an accident, but a feature of the system. Government accountants had calculated that prisoner deaths would reduce long-term costs while maintaining productivity through the constant arrival of new inmates. Fresh prisoners brought energy and hope that veteran inmates had lost. The turnover was economically optimal. The first death from road construction came not from the expected causes, cold, exhaustion, or accident, but from an encounter that reminded everyone that humans were not the only inhabitants of this wilderness. On June 15, 1891, a brown bear weighing over 400 kilograms emerged from the forest during tree-clearing operations and killed a prisoner named Watanabe before the guards could react. But Watanabe's death revealed something crucial about the chain system's effectiveness. When the bear attacked, the 6 prisoners chained together could not scatter. They could not run. They could only move as their chains allowed, slowly, coordinatedly, and entirely predictably. The bear killed 1 man and maimed 2 others before guards drove it off with rifle fire. The attack became a metaphor for the entire Abashiri system. Individual death was acceptable as long as it did not compromise collective productivity. Watanabe was replaced within a week by a new prisoner from the mainland. The chains were lengthened by 30 centimeters to allow slightly faster movement. Work continued. Over the following months, the wilderness claimed more lives: bears, wolves, falls from unstable trees, hypothermia from sudden weather changes, and simple exhaustion from work that pushed human endurance beyond its limits. But each death only reinforced the system's core logic. The prisoners were expendable resources in a grand economic calculation. The guards, too, became part of the machine. They lived in barracks only marginally more comfortable than prisoner cells, isolated from their families for months at a time, watching over men who died with disturbing regularity. Many guards requested transfers after a single winter. Those who remained began to display the same psychological symptoms as their prisoners: withdrawal, depression, and a growing inability to see the inmates as human beings. This dehumanization was essential to the system's operation. Guard training manuals, preserved in the National Police Agency archives, explicitly instructed officers to view prisoners not as individuals, but as units of labor whose welfare mattered only insofar as it affected productivity. Guards who showed sympathy for prisoner suffering were reassigned or dismissed. The psychological architecture of Abashiri extended beyond the chains. and into the very design of daily life. The evening moral instruction sessions served as the final component of the system's assault on individual identity. Buddhist monks, recruited specifically for their ability to detect dissent, preached about karma, redemption, and the necessity of accepting one's fate. But these sessions were intelligence-gathering operations disguised as spiritual comfort. The monks reported prisoner conversations, political discussions, and escape planning directly to the warden. Even the possibility of spiritual solace became a tool of surveillance. The reports submitted by these monks, discovered in Buddhist temple archives in 1994, reveal the systematic nature of the psychological manipulation. Prisoners who expressed doubt, anger, or hope were identified for additional supervision. Those who showed signs of organizing resistance faced immediate punishment. The goal was not salvation, but the identification and suppression of dangerous thoughts before they could spread. Yet human ingenuity found ways to subvert even this totalitarian system. Within months of the prison's opening, an intricate underground economy had developed that functioned despite constant surveillance. The currency was survival itself. Extra portions of food, information about the outside world, small comforts that made existence bearable. Miso soup became the gold standard of this economy. An extra ladle meant the difference between slow starvation and minimal sustenance. Prisoners traded information, labor, and loyalty for these precious additional calories. The weakest prisoners, those barely able to work, would perform personal services for stronger inmates in exchange for enough food to survive another day. But the most sophisticated element of this underground economy involved the wooden Nipopo dolls that prisoners carved during evening hours. Officially, this craft program was therapeutic, a way to keep prisoners' hands busy and their minds focused on constructive activity. In reality, it became an elaborate smuggling and communication network. The dolls themselves were hollow, allowing for the concealment of messages, small tools, and even primitive weapons. Carved symbols conveyed information about guard schedules, work assignments, and prisoner hierarchies. The dolls became currency, traded for favors and protection. Most remarkably, they became the medium through which escape plans were communicated. Prison records, declassified in 1975, reveal that guards were aware of this system and in many cases participated in it. Guards accepted bribes in the form of expertly carved dolls and crafted items, which they sold to villagers in Abashiri. The dolls that were meant to suppress communication became the foundation of corruption that undermined the system's absolute control. Warden Okabayashi discovered the full extent of this underground economy during an unannounced inspection in February 1893. Hidden in cell walls, he found fermented rice wine, tobacco plants grown from seeds smuggled in food deliveries, carved tools capable of picking locks, and enough contraband to stock a small shop. He faced an impossible choice: punish everyone involved and risk a rebellion that could destroy the facility, or acknowledge that absolute control was an illusion. His decision revealed the fundamental contradiction at the heart of the Abashiri system. He chose to ignore what he had found, but to use the knowledge as leverage. The underground economy would continue under his oversight. Prisoners who cooperated with authorities would enjoy access to additional privileges. Those who challenged his power would find themselves excluded from the very system that made survival possible. It was a masterpiece of psychological manipulation that turned the prisoners' own survival instincts against them. They became complicit in maintaining the system that oppressed them, because challenging it meant losing access to the resources they needed to stay alive. This delicate balance of oppression and corruption sustained Abashiri through its early years, creating a stability that was more effective than any amount of force. But stability in a system built on human suffering is always fragile. And in March 1909, that stability would be tested by the one enemy that no amount of planning could control: fire. The flames that would consume Abashiri prison began at 2:17 in the afternoon of March 15, 1909, with a grease fire in the kitchen building that no one initially considered dangerous. Kitchen fires were common in facilities that relied on wood stoves for cooking and heating. The prison had procedures for containing such incidents. But procedures written for mainland prisons proved useless in Hokkaido's unique conditions. The isolation that made escape impossible also made fire suppression hopeless. There was no fire department, no water supply beyond the prison's hand-operated pump, no neighboring buildings to serve as fire breaks. When the flames spread from the kitchen to the wooden walkway connecting to the main cell block, Abashiri became a death trap for 1,200 men. The timeline of destruction tells the story of institutional priorities under extreme pressure. At 2:23, flames reached the walkway. At 2:45, the prison's inadequate hand pump proved useless against the spreading fire. At 3:30, guards faced a choice that would define their character: fight the fire or contain the prisoners. They chose containment. Rather than focus their efforts on saving the facility, guards prioritized preventing prisoner escapes during the chaos. Cell blocks remained locked, even as smoke began filling the corridors. Prisoners were kept chained together, even as flames approached their living quarters. The machine's first priority was maintaining control, not preserving life. By 6:15 that evening, 80% of Abashiri prison had been reduced to ash and twisted metal. Only the stone foundation and one cell block remained standing. 23 prisoners died in the fire, not from flames, but from smoke inhalation while chained in cells that guards had refused to unlock. The investigation that followed revealed the deeper institutional rot that the fire had exposed. Guards admitted they had feared prisoner revolt more than complete destruction of the facility. The underground economy that Warden Okabayashi had tolerated had created such extensive prisoner networks that authorities believed an organized escape attempt was inevitable if security protocols were relaxed even temporarily. The fire had not been set intentionally, but prisoners had discussed arson for months as the only way to create chaos sufficient for escape attempts. Guards' paranoia proved more destructive than any planned sabotage. As smoke cleared and the true extent of the destruction became apparent, Warden Okabayashi surveyed the ruins and made a decision that would determine Abashiri's future. The prison would be rebuilt immediately, using prisoner labor, but this time it would be fireproof. The decision would require 3 more years of brutal construction in sub-zero temperatures, but it would also create something unprecedented: a prison that could survive any natural or human threat. The rebuilding of Abashiri became a demonstration of the system's core philosophy taken to its logical extreme. If prisoners could build the instrument of their oppression once, they could rebuild it better. If suffering could create discipline, more suffering could create perfection. Construction began immediately, even as winter temperatures dropped to 20 degrees below zero. Surviving prisoners were forced to work in conditions that pushed human endurance beyond all reasonable limits. The new specifications reflected the lessons learned from the fire. Brick and concrete construction requiring 47,000 bricks manufactured on site using prison labor. The prisoners became their own brickmakers, quarrying clay from frozen ground and operating kilns that had to be fed constantly to maintain the temperatures necessary for proper curing. They manufactured cement from limestone quarried in conditions that would have challenged professional miners. They operated steam boilers that required round-the-clock maintenance to prevent the water lines from freezing. The architectural design maintained the 5-wing panopticon structure but incorporated steel doors, concrete floors, and fireproof materials throughout. The heating system used steam generated by coal-fired boilers, operated entirely by prisoner labor. Every element of the reconstruction was designed to be prisoner-maintained, creating a self-sustaining system that required minimal outside resources. Construction accounting reveals the true cost of this rebuilding effort. The new prison required 127,000 yen, nearly 3 times the cost of the original facility. But government budgets categorized this expenditure as infrastructure improvement rather than prisoner expense, hiding the astronomical cost from public scrutiny. The human cost was even more devastating. Prisoner mortality rates doubled during the reconstruction period due to exposure, overwork, and accidents involving heavy machinery operated by men with no training in industrial construction. But completion deadlines remained unchanged, creating a conflict between human survival and administrative efficiency. that the system resolved in predictable fashion. Survival was secondary to productivity. Individual lives mattered only as components in the larger machine. The rebuilt Abashiri would be stronger than its predecessor because it was forged through suffering that exceeded even the original construction. The new prison opened in 1912 as a monument to the power of systematic oppression to overcome any obstacle. It was fireproof, escape-proof, and designed to operate with minimal outside intervention. It was the perfect machine for destroying human spirits through architecture and routine. But perfection in a system built on human suffering contains the seeds of its own obsolescence. The rebuilt Abashiri was so efficient at breaking men that it began to attract the attention of those who could not be broken. And in 1944, one such man would arrive to test whether human ingenuity could defeat institutional perfection. His name was Yoshi Shiratori, and he would become the most famous prisoner in Japanese history. Yoshi Shiratori arrived at Abashiri prison on November 3, 1944, carrying a reputation that preceded him like a shadow. He had already escaped from 3 maximum security facilities across Japan, each time demonstrating an understanding of institutional weaknesses that bordered on supernatural intuition. Prison officials who transferred him to Abashiri believed they were sending him to the one place from which escape was impossible. They were wrong. Shiratori was 34 years old, slightly built, with hands that seemed too delicate for manual labor, but possessed a sensitivity that could detect the smallest imperfection in metal, stone, or wood. He had been convicted of murder, a crime he maintained he did not commit, but his protests of innocence had become secondary to his growing legend as an escape artist whose methods defied conventional understanding. What made Shiratori unique was not physical strength or criminal cunning, but an almost scientific approach to institutional analysis. He understood that every prison was a complex system with inherent contradictions, and that those contradictions could be exploited by someone patient enough to study them and ingenious enough to act on what he discovered. His first weeks at Abashiri were spent in careful observation. While other prisoners focused on survival, Shiratori studied the architecture of oppression that surrounded him. He mapped guard rotations with the precision of a military strategist, noting that there was a 47-minute window during shift changes when surveillance was reduced. He observed the behavior of the chains that bound him to his fellow prisoners, testing their strength and flexibility during the daily work assignments. Most importantly, he studied the one element that guards could not control: the effect of Hokkaido's brutal climate on the materials used to construct his cage. The leg irons that chained Shiratori to his work gang were forged from iron that contained trace amounts of sulfur, an impurity that made the metal susceptible to corrosion under specific conditions. The daily rations of miso soup provided those conditions. The soup's high salt content, combined with the natural acids produced by fermentation, created a weak but persistent corrosive agent. Shiratori began saving portions of his miso soup, allowing it to ferment in a hidden container fashioned from a hollowed-out piece of wood. Over 18 months, he applied this homemade acid to his leg irons each night, weakening the metal molecule by molecule until it would snap under sudden pressure. But corroding the chains was only the first element of his escape plan. He also had to develop the physical capability to scale Abashiri's walls. Walls designed to be unclimbable by men weakened through systematic malnutrition and exhaustion. Shiratori created an exercise regimen that he performed in his cell during the brief periods when guards were not watching, building the specific muscle groups needed for climbing while maintaining the appearance of the broken man that authorities expected to see. He practiced what he called invisible exercises, isometric contractions that built strength without visible movement. He developed his finger strength by gripping small irregularities in his cell walls, holding his body weight for progressively longer periods. He trained his legs by performing hundreds of calf raises while maintaining the posture of a man at rest. The psychological preparation was equally important. Shiratori studied the behavior patterns of guards and fellow prisoners, learning to become invisible through absolute conformity to expected behavior. He never spoke of escape, never displayed anger or frustration, never gave any indication that his spirit had not been completely broken by the Abashiri system. This performance was so convincing that guards began to view him as an ideal prisoner, quiet, compliant, and apparently resigned to his fate. His reputation as an escape artist became a source of amusement rather than concern. The man who had defeated 3 maximum security prisons seemed to have finally met his match in the frozen wasteland of Hokkaido. On the night of August 26, 1944, after 18 months of preparation, Shiratori put his plan into action. During the 11:30 guard rotation, he snapped his corroded leg irons with a sudden twisting motion that he had practiced hundreds of times in his mind. The metal parted with a sound like a stick breaking. Quiet enough to avoid detection, but decisive enough to free him from the chain gang system that had held him for over a year. Moving through the prison corridors with the silence of a man who had memorized every floorboard, every door hinge, every patrol route, Shiratori reached the outer wall at exactly 12:17 in the morning. The climb that should have been impossible for a malnourished prisoner took him less than 4 minutes. His months of invisible exercise had prepared him for this moment with scientific precision. By 12:21, Yoshi Shiratori was free in the Hokkaido wilderness, beginning what would become the most famous manhunt in Japanese criminal history. But Shiratori's escape represented more than individual achievement. It proved that the Abashiri system's psychological control was an illusion that one man's determination could shatter. If the perfect prison could be defeated by fermented soup and isometric exercises, then perhaps the entire philosophy of control through suffering was fundamentally flawed. The discovery of Shiratori's escape came during the 4:30 morning roll call on August 27th. Guards found a straw dummy in his bed, a crude decoy that had fooled the night shift but could not withstand daylight inspection. The broken leg iron was discovered hidden beneath his mattress, its corroded surface telling the story of 18 months of patient chemical warfare against the state's most secure facility. Warden Takahashi, who had replaced Okabayashi 2 years earlier, immediately ordered a complete lockdown of the facility. Every prisoner was strip-searched, every cell was inspected, every guard was interrogated about their activities during the previous night. The search revealed the full extent of Shiratori's preparation: hidden tools, exercise equipment fashioned from prison materials, and a detailed map of the surrounding wilderness carved into the back of his wooden food bowl. The manhunt that followed became a national obsession that transformed Shiratori from criminal to folk hero. 2,400 police officers were deployed across 47 prefectures. Every train station, bus depot, and port in northern Japan was placed under surveillance. Photographs of Shiratori appeared in newspapers throughout the country, accompanied by stories that painted him as a master escape artist whose ingenuity had outwitted Japan's most secure prison. For 160 days, Shiratori remained free while the largest manhunt in Japanese history failed to locate him. He survived by working odd jobs under assumed names, sleeping in temples and abandoned buildings, and relying on the sympathy of ordinary citizens who admired a man who had defeated the infamous Abashiri prison. The psychological effect of his freedom was as important as the physical fact of his escape. Every day that Shiratori remained at large was proof that the system's control was imperfect, that human ingenuity could triumph over institutional oppression. His legend grew with each passing week, inspiring other prisoners to attempt their own escapes and transforming public perception of Abashiri from symbol of justice to symbol of cruelty. Police reports from this period, declassified in 1994, reveal the extent to which Shiratori's escape had undermined confidence in the entire prison system. Other facilities reported increased escape attempts by prisoners who believed they could duplicate Shiratori's methods. Prison guards throughout Japan began displaying symptoms of paranoia and depression as they realized that their control over inmates was more fragile than they had believed. The end came not through police investigation, but through Shiratori's own surrender. On February 3, 1945, he walked into a police station in Aomori Prefecture and announced his identity to the desk sergeant. He claimed that homesickness and exhaustion had defeated him where prison walls could not, but interviews with Shiratori years later revealed a different motivation for his surrender. He had proven that escape from Abashiri was possible, and that proof was more valuable than continued freedom. His goal had never been permanent liberty, but demonstration that the system's power was an illusion, maintained only through collective acceptance of its inevitability. Shiratori's return to Abashiri triggered immediate reforms in prison security protocols, but his legend had already achieved its purpose. He had transformed the narrative of Abashiri from triumphant deterrent to cruel anachronism. Public opinion, influenced by wartime propaganda that emphasized individual heroism over institutional authority, began to turn against the harsh philosophy that the prison represented. More importantly, Shiratori had demonstrated that the human spirit could survive and even triumph over systematic attempts to destroy it. His escape became a symbol of hope for prisoners throughout Japan, and a source of embarrassment for authorities who had believed their system was perfect. But the world was changing in ways that would make Shiratori's individual rebellion seem quaint compared to the social upheaval that was approaching. World War II was ending, Japan was facing occupation and reconstruction, and the entire philosophy of governance that had created Abashiri was about to be challenged by new ideas about human rights, rehabilitation, and the purpose of punishment. The 1950s and 1960s brought changes to Japan that transformed every aspect of society, including its approach to criminal justice. The post-war Constitution, written under American influence, emphasized individual rights and human dignity in ways that were incompatible with the Abashiri philosophy of control through suffering. Prison reform movements, inspired by international human rights advocacy, began demanding humane treatment for all inmates. Academic studies demonstrated that rehabilitation programs reduced recidivism more effectively than punishment alone. Economic analysis showed that the cost of operating facilities like Abashiri had become prohibitive compared to more modern approaches to criminal justice. Internal government studies from this period, released through Freedom of Information requests in the 1980s, revealed that Abashiri's reputation was actually encouraging certain criminals who sought notoriety or martyrdom. The deterrent effect that had justified the prison's harsh conditions was being reversed by cultural changes that glorified individual resistance to authority. The economic miracle that transformed Japan during these decades also changed public expectations about government services and institutional efficiency. Citizens who had accepted harsh conditions during wartime and Reconstruction began demanding that their government demonstrate the same technological sophistication and humane values that characterized Japan's emerging role as a modern, prosperous democracy. Abashiri, with its 19th-century philosophy and increasingly outdated infrastructure, became an embarrassment to a nation that was positioning itself as a leader in industrial innovation and social progress. International attention focused on Japan's prison system as the country prepared to host the 1964 Olympics, forcing officials to confront whether Abashiri represented justice or international humiliation. The prisoner population was also changing in ways that challenged the facility's original purpose. The political dissidents and hardened criminals for whom Abashiri had been designed were being replaced by ordinary offenders whose crimes reflected social problems rather than ideological threats. These men did not require the extreme security measures that defined the Abashiri system, and their presence in such harsh conditions became increasingly difficult to justify. By the late 1970s, operating Abashiri had become a bureaucratic ritual performed out of institutional inertia rather than practical necessity. The facility consumed enormous resources while serving a population that could be housed more effectively and humanely in modern correctional facilities. The annual operating cost had risen to 847,000 yen, while its effectiveness as either deterrent or rehabilitation center had virtually disappeared. The decision to close the historic Abashiri prison came in 1983, after 93 years of operation that had seen the facility transform from symbol of state power to monument to institutional obsolescence. The closure was announced not as admission of failure but as evidence of progress, proof that Japan had evolved beyond the need for such harsh measures. The logistics of closing Abashiri revealed the extent to which the institution had become disconnected from its original purpose. 347 prisoners were transferred to modern facilities that offered better security, more effective rehabilitation programs, and significantly lower operating costs. 156 staff members were reassigned to positions throughout the national prison system. 23 historic buildings were designated for preservation as reminders of a darker period in Japanese criminal justice. But the most revealing aspect of the closure came from exit interviews with the final prisoners. 67% requested to remain at the old facility rather than transfer to modern prisons. They preferred the familiar suffering of Abashiri to the unknown challenges of contemporary incarceration. This preference suggested either Stockholm Syndrome or a genuine attachment to a system that, however brutal, had provided structure and meaning that the prisoners feared losing. It was the first indication that institutional control could become a form of care for those who had nowhere else to go. As the last prisoner left the historic facility on March 15, 1984, exactly 75 years after the fire that had nearly destroyed it, administrators discovered something in their records that would reshape the entire narrative of what Abashiri had represented. Hidden among decades of bureaucratic documentation was evidence that the prison's transformation had already begun, in ways that no one had anticipated or intended. The evidence would emerge fully only in the following decades, as Japan's aging population began a slow-motion crisis that would transform the entire relationship between individual citizens and institutional care. But the seeds of that transformation had been planted in the final years of Abashiri's operation, when the harsh philosophy of punishment through isolation began to attract those who sought isolation as sanctuary. The machine designed to break human spirits was about to become a refuge for spirits that society had already broken.